This was really a fascinating session, and we'll move on to our concluding session of this webinar. We're going to start with Professor Gad Barzilai, who Itamar already presented as a PI at the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions. Gadi is a professor of law, political science, and international studies in the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington, Dean Emeritus of the University of Haifa Law Faculty, and Vice Provost Emeritus of the University of Haifa. His academic degrees and training are from Tel Aviv University, Hebrew University, Yale, and the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He's the author of several award-winning books, including The Communities in Law, Politics and Cultures of Legal Identities, University of Michigan Press, in which he paved the way for a new understanding of the role of communities in shaping practices in law and towards it. In his book, Wars, Internal Conflicts and Political Order, which was SUNY Press, 1996, he suggests a new way to understand the construction of political, legal order and disorder in times of national security emergencies. He has a long list of publications on topics as diverse as the politics of rights, comparative law, law and political power, law and violence, communities and law, groups' rights, liberal jurisprudence, national security, democracies and law, and issues concerning the nexus between Middle East Israeli politics and the law. The title of his talk today is The Feasibility and Construction of Confederate and Federal Solutions. And Gadi, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Deborah, and it's great being here. So most of my brief talk would be about federal or the feasibility of federal and mainly confederative solutions. But before I drill into that, just a very brief introduction. I think that in the previous panel, which was certainly fascinating, and I learned a lot, we saw very different narratives about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we do know that actually we have, in the context of the conflict, completely different narratives, and every side is actually telling a very different story, a very different nomos, a different very narrative about the conflict. Now, on paper, one feasible solution would be a territorial compromise. We can mention Yigal Allon, Yitzhak Rabin. Actually, Professor Inbar wrote a book about the national security concept and the peace concept of Rabin. So we can talk about territorial compromises, but as we all know, politically speaking, not necessarily intellectually speaking, it would be a very hard bargain, and we all know that Oslo is not really was not really a success in many ways, and so the whole section of territorial compromises might not be a feasible type of solutions. The second possibility is unilateral withdrawal of Israel from some of the territories, or let's put it in another language, Israel may wish to withdraw its own borders unilaterally, which actually was done previously regarding the annexation of Al-Quds, of East Jerusalem, and the annexation of the Golan Heights. But again, doesn't seem to me as a breakthrough in order to resolve the conflict, nor do I see any Israeli political leader who is able to do what Sharon did, for better or for worse, with the unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And obviously, the West Bank is not Gaza, and we all know the differences, especially now when Hamas is controlling Gaza. So I don't think that either territorial compromises or unilateral withdrawal from parts of the West Bank is really a feasible way to make a breakthrough. So I would like actually in the rest of my brief talk to play an intellectual game about federal and confederate solutions. I should mention actually that I think it was 1996, Efraim will correct me, around the time that Efraim and myself, Professor Inbar, we published an article in the Journal of Armed Forces and Society where we actually analyzed, but it's about 25 years ago, support among the Israeli public around federal and confederate solutions. So I would like to talk briefly about federal solutions and then about confederation. And I would like, in fact, to endorse a possibility of a solution which is a confederative solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict. I should admit it's for me now a sort of an intellectual game. I've not done a research about it as of yet, but I think that, you know, academia should be also a playground for ideas. This is part of our role in a democratic society. But let me begin with a federation. So I think that we have at least 4 successful examples of legal federation. The United States, obviously, Germany, India, and Switzerland. Now, in the case of India, by the way, the Indian constitution is a very intriguing legal document which is in fact embedding a sort of a federal solution to a highly rifted society, highly polarized, with ethno-nationalism, religiosity, territoriality, international conflicts, whatever you would like to find in the context of the Indian conflict, you will find. And the federal solution is working quite well. In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it would be less feasible to think about a federal solution, partly because most of the Jewish population will resist it. They would not believe that it's possible to have a one-state federal solution with the Palestinians, and I am very doubtful whether most of the Palestinians would agree to a federal solution. And I think that the level of mistrust among both Jews and Palestinians regarding each other, a point which in a way should be taken in a more serious account. So in a nutshell, I don't think that the federal solution is feasible, notwithstanding, I think that as scholars, we have to look more carefully into the history of federal solutions and the possibility to embed at least some kind of federal solution in the context of the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I think, however, that to think about a confederative solution might be both intellectually and politically a more intriguing, engaging project. In a nutshell, first of all, unlike a federal solution, in a confederative solutions, we are talking about split sovereignties. We are not talking about one national sovereignty, which would be the case in federal solutions. Secondly, I think this is the basis of what I would like to put for a game in the intellectual playground. That a Palestinian citizens of Nablus or any other municipality in the West Bank would be able to move freely in Israel. And if he or she would like to live in Jaffa, which in the 30s was a major Palestinian cultural center, he or she may do it. Similarly, if a Jew would like to live in any Jewish settlement in the West Bank, may it be Kiryat Arba or Anatot or any other place, he or she may do that. And I think that in both cases, we may argue for an historical justification. You don't have to call it an historical legal right, because once you are going into the issue whether history create a legal right, it's a very convoluted field. But Palestinians and Jews are both indigenous communities. And I think that it makes an historical sense and a justified sense to allow a Jew to live wherever he would like in the West Bank, and it would make a lot of sense to allow a Palestinian to live wherever he would like in Israel itself. Obviously, there is a major issue of Hakel Auda, right of return. I think that the right of return in the context that I'm playing in the intellectual playground should be transformed into a regime of compensations. Otherwise, I think that the feasibility of such a solution would be almost non-existent. And about Jerusalem, I would go back to the resolution, UN Resolution 181, with another version, namely that each community, namely Jews and Muslims and Christians and Armenians, would be able to manage their own religious sites. This is not the actual corpus separatum of Resolution 181, but I'm offering a sort of a version, another version to the corpus separatum idea. Last and not least, about that kind of a confederative possible solution, who is ruling what? So I think that there should be, according to that idea on the playground, one Palestinian parliament. It can be wherever in the West Bank, including in Al-Quds. And there is one Israeli parliament in Jerusalem. Palestinians would vote for the Palestinian parliament. I'm not talking now about the Israeli Arabs. I'm talking about Palestinians in the West Bank and obviously Jews, whether in the West Bank, in the Jewish settlements, or in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or everywhere, would be able, like now, to vote for the Knesset. So we can talk about split sovereignty idea. There is an issue of armed forces, but actually, as we talk, we have Palestinian police forces who are doing their job in the West Bank, and we have an Israeli military, which is doing partly a police forcing tasks in the West Bank that they shouldn't do. I mean, a military should not do policing tasks. So I think that in many ways, that kind of a confederative idea may do well both to the Palestinian national security interest and for the Israeli Palestinians' interest. Now, against my idea, there are two issues that might be raised and should be taken very seriously. One issue is that we don't have a good history of confederation solutions. We don't have a good record of former Yugoslavia. if you travel in Serbia or Montenegro, wherever you travel in former republics of Yugoslavia, you see lots of hatred and a lot of trauma from the civil war. And I can give you other historical examples. So one issue that we have to deal with, that we don't have a good history of confederations. We do have a better history of federations, but federations in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think, are much less feasible. Secondly, obviously, we are scholars. Our playground is seminar room and academia. We are not, we don't have power. We don't have the strength of might. And much will depend on politicians. And I agree with Asad Rassem that politically speaking, time is against us. But this is exactly why I think that we need to think out of the box of territorial compromises, out of the box of unilateral withdrawal. I think that we have to move into federative and confederation ideas in order to move forward. Thanks very much.
Gadi, this was fascinating. I think what I want to suggest is instead of taking questions after each of the lectures, let's save them for the end and for Itamar's concluding remarks so that we can also include the third session, so we can have a discussion among all of them, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
It's okay?
Yeah,
all right.
Thanks.
Okay, really fascinating. The next speaker is Professor Efraim Inbar, the president of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. His degrees are in political science from the Hebrew University and the University of Chicago. Professor Inbar has served as the founding director of the University of Chicago's Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. He's held visiting professor or scholar positions at Georgetown, Johns Hopkins, Boston University, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. His area of specialization is Middle Eastern strategic issues. He's authored 5 books and edited 12 collections of articles. He's also served as the president of the Israel Association for International Studies, and his talk today is entitled Conflict Management in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict.
Shalom to everybody, particularly to Gad Barzilai, which I've not seen for years. And it's good to see you. It was a Publius piece, I believe, that we wrote about public opinion. And I will speak about conflict management because I am a policy-oriented academic. So I try to think in pragmatic terms. As you all know, the Oslo process was not a great success. And I think there were 3 main reasons for the lack of success. First of all, the gap in the position of the 2 national movements. I think that Israel, particularly under Rabin, was ready for, in my view at least, a generous territorial compromise. I think the Palestinians had no realistic goals, basically believing that Israel will give up on Jerusalem or on on the return, all these things. I don't think the Palestinians, until this very day, have a pragmatic approach to the conflict. Also, what happened after Rabin tried to instate or to bring about a statist approach to the Palestinian national movement, he failed. Primarily because as the main requirement of a state, according to Weber, as we all learned, I learned it many years ago, you need monopoly over use force to have a state. So the two-state approach failed because the Palestinians were unable to establish a state in the most strictest term. And they have militias. They lost one part of their territory to Gaza. And I must say that this is probably not only their problem. We see this type of issue with much of the rest of the Arab world, where there is no monopoly over use of force. We see it in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Libya. So maybe this is a problem with the contemporary Arab political culture. And so for a two-state solution, you need the two states, and there is no state on the other side. Finally, and I think this is the most important reason why the Oslo process has failed, is that the two national movements still have energies to fight. Basically, conflict, ethno-religious conflict, such as the one we are speaking about, will end when at least one side is tired. Tired of continue to fighting, tired of paying the costs of conflict. And if I look at the situation, both sides still have a lot of energies to fight. Look at Gaza, look at terrorist groups that are growing in the West Bank. Basically, the Palestinian society is still ready to fight for things which are important to it. The Jewish national movement, the same. Personally, I am ready to fight for Jerusalem, for united Jerusalem. I want to be in control of the Temple Mount. I say it, and I'm not the only one, not only Zionists that says those things, and therefore, there is no solution. And I think looking for a solution is problematic because trying, a conflict resolution approach is not helpful if there is no real possibility for a solution. Over time, it also became quite clear that the Palestinian issue is not the root of the problems in the Middle East. We have other things. We have radical Islam, we have Iran, we have Turkey now, an aggressor. And actually, the Palestinian issue has attracted much less attention of the international community, and it is on the back burner. So I think that the international community, and from my own perspective, there is less urgency to solve the problem. Basically, somehow things are moving with not too much cost to both sides. I think also that in absence of a possible, realistic solution, we should try to manage the conflict. Basically, gaining time. By the way, this has been always a Zionist approach. Ben-Gurion said, we are here, we'll fight until the Arabs get tired. And by the way, in terms of historic process, obviously, he was right. After all, Egypt made peace with us because it got tired of the conflict. Jordan, for common interest, made peace with us. And even the Palestinian national movement that wanted formally to destroy the Jewish state, accepted to some extent, with some caveats, the two-state solution. And they got tired of the conflict because they paid a too heavy price. So trying to gain time could be useful because things may change. For the better, of course, they can change also for worse. So I admit that. We don't know what we'll see in the future. So under those circumstances, the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security has formally adopted this approach, and they proposed it to the government. I think the government under Netanyahu in recent years has basically practiced conflict management, and we put it in writing. So effective management of conflict, I'll say maybe something about federal solutions that Gadi mentioned. I think that another problem that you didn't mention and this is why this is a very problematic proposition, is the issue of identity. In India, I do a lot of business with India, strategic ties. There is an a core Indian identity in all ethnic groups. This is why India is successful in this. America obviously has an identity, and even the Swiss have, obviously, but the Europeans have differences. In Belgium, it doesn't work, for example. It's a very strenuous situation. So what does effective management entail? First of all, Israel should implement policies that ease tensions and reduce the risks of violent escalation. Those policies should be subject to vital national interests. And only if there is a vital national interest, we should interfere. Judicious use of force. After all, we are fighting. This is an armed conflict. The use of force should be very calibrated to hurt people inciting violence. And we should distinguish very clearly between terrorists and the rest of the population. Not to bring more Palestinians into the position of being very offended or seeing no choice and being attracted to the option of violence. We should also improve the governance in Area C. We should enforce all the laws concerning Area C. Area A and B is Palestinian. And primarily to block the development of nationalist Palestinian projects. They emulate us, they build settlements, they build roads. Khan el-Ahmar, for example, which sits on the road number 1, which is very vital for Israel, going from the coast to the Jordan Valley, and to try to convince the Europeans to stop this nonsense. Of course, carrots and sticks. This has been the Israeli policy for years vis-a-vis the Palestinians. We should try to encourage the local leadership to cooperate by economic sticks. The Trump plan, which is a very realistic approach, and we support it in its entirety, is one way to improve the lives of the Palestinians. We can speak about transportation contiguity and other projects. And at the same time, of course, if necessary, to use force or to use other coercive measures. We do advocate a restrained settlement policy because we want to preserve the option of a territorial compromise. And this should be very clear. Myself and others are basically advocates of the Alon plan. And I think that this government, whatever people say, tries to implement the Rabin strategic legacy. It's not a far-right fantasy, what they're doing. It is basically looking at the last speech of Rabin in October 95 and try to implement it more or less. Basically strengthening the Jewish presence in Greater Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley. This should be accompanied by public diplomacy. And we try our best to explain the strategic rationale of this strategy, obviously first to the Americans, and I think they understand us. I think we are convincing the moderate Arab states that were basically mobilized to support the Trump plan. And from what I know, other important countries do understand, if not supporting us. You know, India, Brazil is a different story, of course, now with the evangelical president. So there is attentive ear to this type of arguments, which are more realpolitik, that make sense to people that don't want to have a bloody conflict. There is now a Trump plan on the table. It's not clear what the Americans are doing now, to what extent they are supporting it. But in case of annexation of areas in Judea and Samaria, the Institute recommends that such action should be taken in light of 3 criteria. First criteria is that the area to be incorporated into the state of Israel should have a national security value, like Greater Jerusalem. Jerusalem is, I don't want to expand this, but it's a very important site, most important junction in the land of Israel, and of course, the Jordan Valley. The second criteria is that this type of deed should not burden Israel with a demographic problem, which is a euphemism for Palestinians or Arabs. And the third criteria is that it should command large public support. And I ran polls. I ran polls with God, many years ago about national security issues. They continue to do so. And it's quite clear that those 2 areas, Greater Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley, fall into this category. I don't know what will happen, but basically this will be part of conflict management, basically signaling to everybody, and particularly to the Palestinians, that there are certain things that they should forget about if they want some kind of peaceful coexistence with the Jewish state, which after all is much stronger. And if we talk about borders, I'll end with a general observation about how borders are determined. Borders are determined by power differential and by demographics. And this is my advice to the government. And I hope they listen. Thank you.
Professor Inbar, thank you. Again, I'm going to hold the questions. I'm sure there are many questions and comments until the end, and give our other speakers a chance as well. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Rassem Khamaisi from the Department of Environmental Studies, Geography and Environmental Studies. Actually, now we're a school, but I forget what the name is. Professor Khamaisi is a professor of geography and planning in the department at the University of Haifa. He was elected in 2007 as the president of the Israeli Geographical Association. He received his PhD from the Hebrew University. He also received a master's from the Technion and a BA in geography from Ben Gurion University. He's a member of many professional, international, and local associations and NGOs involved in public and environmental policy issues, planning and development. Among his many projects, he managed a planning project funded by the Israeli Home Office, the Israeli Land Administration Office, and the Prime Minister's Office. He's a senior researcher at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. He's the founder and director of the Center for Planning and Studies, which engages in urban and strategic planning and management. A strong focus of his efforts is geography, urbanization, and planning among Palestinians in Israel and in the Palestinian territory in Jerusalem. He'll talk about from back to back to face, spatial development of Israel-Palestine. Rassem.
Good afternoon for all of you. Assalamu alaikum, shalom aleichem. It's my honor to speak in this seminar, and I am actually sad to hear about the principle of my colleague Efraim shaping about how we going forward. How we going forward? Actually, it's come from point of view of Israeli Zionists, which ignore the existence and the right of the Palestinians. If we want to live together in this small piece of land, we have to pace in one word. It's called dignity. Dignity. It's very important because we can, speaking about what we call compromising, territorial compromising, we can speak, but there are some of principle, which values, which could be compromised on to create acceptance as a base for possible share the space, share the future, and this is land that today about the project, Zionist project, was come and put it a lot of localities, include in West Bank, according to today, about 60% of West Bank under de facto control of Israeli government, not just from security point of view, even according to civic issues such as planning. And within Area C, today, it's not empty of Palestinians. There are living there more than 200 localities. There are living there more than 350,000 Palestinians. This is the reservoir of Palestinian development. That means if we think about the future, we have to think in dignity and respect. And put it by lecture by from back to back to face, what that mean for me, face to face? That's mean for me as some of them values, that values both of soft division, recognition, complementary, shared, coordination, balancing, considering. This is values, which is very important. I know that's what we call conflicts is part of the life. I am today more than 6 years old. I am learning such enough and I know the history and I try to project the future. Yes, but there are some kind, this is conflict change according what we call who's gained the power, who's have gained the resources. And that's mean if we want to continue, and this is the issue, that means there are no solution. We can produce some of terminology. We can produce some of out of the box solution, but how we put it then when we are still not internally as a person, as a collective, accept that the other or the diverse. I do not want to use the word the otherness, because I not like it. I know the diverse as a value. The diverse, I am a planner. We have to think for the future of the community. If we do not change our discourse, Oslo was actually as a leverage for possible shared future building in this piece of land. Actually, it's as a leverage for possible of compromising. Okay, it's a leverage for possible of how we can from transfer of domination, Jewish domination, Israeli domination, to actually respecting the national right of the Palestinian. Unfortunately, because the Israeli continue to put the fact on the ground, to create some kind, to continue to expand the settlement, expand to strengthen the occupation, to about the demography, to transfer Israeli West Bank, again, the international law, which could be respected. Unfortunately, still, a lot of people among the Zionists, right, not respect the international law. That means for them it's internal law. And for them, actually, the idea of also come about paradigm, which separate between territorial and people. And actually, still until today, what we put a status of the Palestinian within East Jerusalem, it not gain to be a citizen. If we want annexation, it cannot be annexation just for the territory. It should be annexation for the territory and the human. And the human have to be a citizen right, according to the basic value which you believe and I am believe. I want to put them. That's mean why we fail Oslo, and we have driven some lessons from experience about the temporary, about the stages, about building confidence. Actually, this is some of kind of idea what's behind, but from the beginning, the different understanding. And here I want to back to the language, the term. If we want to go in the future, we have to put in common understanding between the Palestinian and the Israeli what meaning of term, state, what that mean, compromise, what that mean, annexation, what that mean, citizenship, what that mean, segregation, what that mean, what is the apartheid, what that mean in the context, because I know there are a lot of the people that produce a new terminology, and we're going to explain that terminology, and we are an academy which should be very active in producing terminology and transfer it to policy making and produce it to the politics decision to accept it, because it's very important for us. Here in our situation now, actually, we have, unfortunately, different narrative, different power, we have a different vision. And in such situation, unfortunately, we cannot put a framing to possible solution or even compromising, even arrangement. As we want to continue to live here, we are a demographobia, to continue with the term of demographobia, to have a fear from demographia. I think this is a problematic context, and we have to think in different, what I suggest in this context, we have to transfer and to change our terminology. We have to build a new terminology, a new narrative, a new, not to expand and to dismantle the past, but to learn, listen from the past for better future. If we want to, this is area. Now, within West Bank, there are exist, to include East Jerusalem, about 700,000 settlers living there. That means within Israel, there are Arab Palestinians who living within Israel is 1,600,000. That means we create some kind of, in this territory, mixed, territorial mixed localities. Both now believe that this is territory belong to them. And if somebody think that the Palestinian, in spite of they are weak today, in spite of they are fragmented, but there are two principles that are building within the mental and in the thinking of the Palestinian. One, the national right, the identity, national identity, and actually they want to build their nation state beside Israeli state. And I think we have, for the vision of the future, in spite of Oslo Fair, we have to get some lessons
Rassem, thank you very much. And we are going to move on to our last speaker, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for conversation among us all. And it's Dr. Itamar Mann, Principal Investigator at the Minerva Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions, and a member of the University of Haifa Faculty of Law. His research is in international law and political theory. He teaches international law and a number of related courses, including an elective on law and terrorism, environmental law, and a clinical seminar on law and politics in the Mediterranean region. Before moving to Haifa, Itamar was a national security law fellow and an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law Center in Washington, D.C. He holds an LLB from Tel Aviv University and an LLM and JSD degrees from Yale Law School. Alongside teaching and research, Itamar provides pro bono consultancy to several human rights organizations, is a member of the Legal Action Committee at the Global Legal Action Network. He's previously provided services to Human Rights Watch and the Open Society Justice Initiative on issues related to refugee and migration law in Europe. And Itamar will offer concluding remarks. And Itamar, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who has been with us. I think these have been a remarkably refreshing set of conversations, not similar to conversations that I've attended elsewhere in Israeli universities, and I'm very proud of that. And I think it really reflects the spirit of our two main organizers, Dr. Rotem Rosenberg-Rubins and Dr. Oren Shlomo. And I just want to open my remarks by recognizing the amazing amount of work that they have put into these 3 days, and really my appreciation. Having said that, I want to offer, very quickly, a framework for conversation about our general themes. And I think that at least today, we have seen talks that are focused on the idea of a solution or the idea of the future of Israel-Palestine, Palestine-Israel, whatever you want to call it. And we have three orientations, in my view, among the speakers, which I want to briefly try to map out and express, articulate their underlying assumptions and perhaps some of their advantages and disadvantages. So first, I think that we heard very strongly from at least two speakers, Asad Ghanem and Efraim Inbar, the view that there is no solution, that basically we are set in a kind of fatal condition that is here to stay, and there is no empirical reality that can reflect otherwise. It's interesting that these two speakers come to this conclusion because both of them obviously spoke from very different political positions, but I think that maybe methodologically there is some parallel to be drawn. And I think this is mainly a kind of commitment to facts, a hard-nosed commitment to the idea that from the facts, we can make predictions about the reality that we live in. And here, both are very, very pessimistic about a solution. I don't know if for Inbar this is a pessimism about the future more generally. I think that he expressed a kind of, satisfaction at the strength and power in Israel and the way that Trump went forward with his plans, but it is a pessimism about the solution. And I think that the possible kind of disadvantage in this orientation is that it has a kind of threat of a naturalistic fallacy. You think that you're so close to the facts by just describing them that you end up further entrenching, or at least this is the hypothesis that this might be problematic, further entrenching a condition that may be quite entrenched, but just to kind of reflect that again and again will not lead to a change. And if that's part of what scholars should do, which is not clear at all, of course, then it's problematic. The second set of ideas that we had here, and I think some speakers have a little bit of each, I think most speakers have a little bit of each, is a kind of reflection on history, to say that history may be a repository of future solutions that we have not yet fully realized or fully been able to reach out to. And here I'm thinking about Professor Gadi Barzilai's call for comparative confederation studies, for what might be called comparative confederation or comparative federation studies, to look at other examples and say this is a good example, this is a bad example, perhaps this we can adopt, and the history then becomes a kind of useful toolbox in a way. And we had some of this in Samer's talk as well. I think that it was very interesting to see the way that Samer seems to be informed by the kind of long durée or long history of the Fatah movement and of Palestinian historical struggles, where it's not at all clear that the Palestinian national movement necessarily has to want what Oslo put on the table. There was indeed a prior history to that. And for him, going back to history also means going back to the history of Palestinian struggles and to various moments that might have been more authentic than what we have today. I think pronouncedly the struggle during the first Intifada, which I believe that Samer also has personal experience and personal involvement and investment in. And Efraim Inbar, I think, also has a component of this kind of reach back to history when he talks about carrot and sticks. And here I want to highlight the colonial history of this idea of carrots and sticks and the way that it has often appeared as a mode of pacification of indigenous communities, going back to the British Mandate in this area, but also in many other parts of the world. To sum up this second orientation, I think that what it gives us, a kind of advantage that it gives us, is to think of justice not as a matter of analysis, but as a matter of development, path dependency, cultural history, material histories in the area, and I think that's absolutely important to keep in mind. The third option that I think is, in a way, the one that we played with, to use Gadi Barzilai's terms, the least, is an option of thinking about a new or totally kind of out-of-the-box solution or set of imaginations that might be applied in this area. And here I want to flag in particular Sari Bashi's talk that I think applies law in a way that is innovative, in a way that is new, in a way that is not necessarily I think familiar to most legal commentators that are looking at this area for a very long time. Law comes as a kind of escape from a kind of history of repeating these kinds of options that seem very, very tired, I think, in Sari's talk. And Samer too had also this component in his conversation when he talked about, we're living together and we need to start talking about the details. And those details, although the Fatah movement and the PLO had previous plans for a one-state solution, they were never thought of. And to spell out details in such a way is really to think anew about this area. And I think that's worth repeating and thinking about. And I want to really highlight Gadi's term once again, this idea of play or of academic activity as a kind of game in which we can try to imagine different futures and allow ourselves to go a little bit down a path that we don't really know where it will bring us. But I think at this time, that notion is extraordinarily important, and I'm really glad that Gadi brought it to our attention during these conversations. I think that going even further, in a way, towards thinking anew about this area would put more emphasis, and that's something that we may discuss in the future, on the present and its very particular challenges. And I'm thinking here specifically about the pandemic, of course, and the reality that it has put in place. Is it any different than what we have known in Israel-Palestine before? And environmental issues, climate change. Samer mentioned the risk of global terrorism, which is also, I think, historically not a kind of constitutive part of what we have in this area, and is also, I think, a new factor that can help us play and think out of the box in a way that is not kind of following a tired and repetitive conversation. Finally, with respect to Rassem's talk, that was the last talk that we heard, I think here the emphasis was on ethics and a kind of call for a face-to-face cultural encounter between the groups. And I really don't know where to put, in which box to put this. I think there are historical sources that spoke more or less in this language about binationalism and about the way that, and I'm thinking here about the kind of Hebrew University leaders in the moment of the founding of the State of Israel that really tried to forward a vision of binationalism in this area, and it kind of struck a chord with that history, at least in my mind. But I think also kind of putting an emphasis on ethics and dignity in a way close to what Sari did is also talking about something new, because the ethics that Rassem talked about, at least in the way that I hear him, is not something that we have experienced here necessarily in the past, and it really requires us once again to start playing. And with that, maybe some of you are hearing that my children in the background are, having some difficulty playing, so I'll put myself on mute. But I'm really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much for all this.
Itamar, thanks so much for those concluding remarks. They open up the conversation really well. And I was, when you were talking about, mentioned Gadi's playing field, well, Efraim, that is a conflict management technique, brainstorming and opening a discourse. Of course, the willingness to explore opportunities is sometimes quite threatening, but that doesn't mean that by exploring them, you agree with them. So on the other hand, it does open the possibility for alternate possible futures. So in that sense, I know that Professor Eli Salzberger, I see on the chat, already wanted to ask or comment in the previous session. So why don't we open up the conversation with Eli, and then anybody who wants to talk, either unmute yourselves and or tell me somehow, and we'll open up the conversation that way. Eli.
Thanks, Deborah. First of all, I'm not an expert, an academic expert, and what can I can say is only as a concerned citizen. First of all, it was really a fascinating discussion and fascinating presentations among individuals who believe in a conflict to be resolved by a peaceful solution and basically believe in equality and human rights. And what I want to remind all of us, that we are the minority on both sides. In both sides, most people do not believe in a peaceful solution in which everybody will enjoy his and her human rights. And, for example, I can dispute and argue with Professor Inbar, but I would say, you know, had I believed that the Trump plan is a real plan in which the Israeli government is standing behind, you know, it could have been some kind of a starting point, but probably this is not the case. The case is that those who are in the majority wants to manipulate the discussion among us between two-state solution and one state, actually to achieve goals that we do not share, all of us. And therefore, you know, my concluding observation is that, you know, the one-state solution looks now a very appealing solution. And I think this is a very, very wrong tactical or strategical move from the peace movement on both sides. It gives ammunition, it gives tools, it gives time to those who want to achieve very different solutions. So this is my, you know, personal observation, not as an academic, but as someone who cares about the conflict and wants to resolve it with human rights, dignity, and peace for all. And I think that this shift of the Israeli left, and now we heard also on the Palestinian side, to the idea of a one-state solution actually gives only ammunition and a lead to the camp, which is, I'm afraid, the majority at the moment on both sides. Thank you.
Okay, are there any more comments or questions from the participants?
And can I say something, please?
Yes, please.
Well, it has been a very informative experience for me participating in this panel. I can agree in some ideas and disagree in others, but really for the presentation of Professor Efraim Inbar, I hope that such a language, which a little bit looked for me hostile, does not reach to more Palestinians. You know, depending on the being the powerful or having power that gives you privilege to control things and play with time until the other gets tired. This is a little bit like a jungle. You know, for the whole world, and I meet on daily basis with the representative of the international community. It was a shock to see that for the first time in history, an elected prime minister in a democracy declares his intention to commit a war crime. Annexation is a war crime. Annexing 1 meter or 2% or 30% of the West Bank is a war crime. It has never happened that clearly an elected prime minister declares his intention for a war crime. And it has happened with Netanyahu. He even included this as part of his coalition agreement. It's really, sometimes we need to think why. For example, in 2014, in the summer of 2014, the Israeli army was doing the protective edge operation in Gaza, where 500 Palestinian kids lost their lives. And 10 kilometers away from Erez in Ashkelon, some Israeli people were enjoying the beach, the sun, as if what's happening there does not relate to them. And I also find similar stories in the Palestinian side. I think dehumanizing the other side is a problem on both sides, and we need to get rid of these. We need to set, first of all, what is the reference in trying to find solution? Is it the balance of power? If it is the balance of power, why do you lose more time? Just, you know, get it done as soon as possible. If this suits more the Israeli majority. If we are talking about international law, we are talking about rights. Let's decide, do we want to fulfill collective rights to the Palestinian people or individual rights? Collective rights, it's adapting the guidelines of Professor Inbar. Just play with time, try to gain some time, extend the occupation until the other side gets tired. And this is gambling. This is political gambling, because you never expect in the Middle East. There is no expert in the Middle East that can tell you this will lead you to somewhere. You are gambling, and you don't know the backfire from where will come and how. I can tell you that now there is a historical opportunity where, someday soon, our old guards, the self-employed leadership in Ramallah, will give the lead to the younger generation. The younger generation will be more open to think in a way that will help us save a lot of suffer on both sides. But what we need to do now as leaders of thought, prepare for a concrete, detailed solution. We need to think about it. Going again through the exploration of a two-state solution is treating we are traitors to our people. We are traitors to the safety, to the security, to the prosperity of our people. We are just playing with their lives, with their time. More realistic could be difficult, but more realistic is talking about equal rights. Okay, it will not come easily. We need to create a lot. We need to raise voice and create a lot of a non-violent noise, not only in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Ramallah, but also we need to create this noise in Washington, D.C., in Berlin, in Brussels, in Paris, in London, in those capitals who have been involved in putting us into this destiny, facing each other. Most of the Israelis or Palestinians did not choose voluntary to be facing each other. It's our destiny who brought us to face each other. So I think we have a lot of responsibility, first of all, to talk a language that does not look hostile to the other side, that deliver a good message, trust building, and be creative in finding solutions that, first of all, can relax, comfort the needs that we are now in the Palestinian side are more realizing and respecting, and we need to see more respect from the Israeli side to our problems. Acknowledging these problems will give us the tools to find solutions.
Summer, thanks very much. I know that Sari also wants to comment. Let me just read a remark that came through on the chat. It's from D-I-A-L-A, Dila. I don't have a last name, but, and unfortunately.
Diala, probably Shema.
Diala? Okay, thank you. So she writes, I appreciate Summer's addressing of refugees as part of his challenge to the representativeness of the PA. I'm also wondering how he squares this with the idea of a negotiated one-state solution. It seems that in practical terms, if we're talking about true equality and the inclusion of historical justice and repair for the harms done, we're in practice looking at mostly Israeli concessions. I believe that she's no longer online. Correct?
You have to leave because of another meeting.
Okay, so that's one question, and Summer, you can come back in the end. Also, Charles would like to make one comment now. Are you still on?
And I believe Sari too.
Right, no, Sari's, I'm gonna have her after the participants. That's what I started with. Charles, would you like to say something? If so, you can unmute your microphone.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Okay.
for me, the big problem that keeps on coming back into my mind is how to get anywhere in view of the political forces and preferences that appear to be predominating in the Israeli, okay? And to be quite frank with you, I see much less of a problem in the Palestinian setting, but I can acknowledge there is a problem too, okay? And, you know, the policies of the occupying power, and I just want to re-inject occupation and the law of occupation here. Okay. The policies of the occupying power, okay, they basically set up a situation in which direct violence is employed by each side justifiably because of the direct violence or non-violent resistance of another side. Yeah. So the real question in my mind is how you get to any of these places that we all are ready to consider with, and perhaps assign different levels of feasibility to, or, okay? One thing that is very clear is that the panelists who talked about basically realist power dynamics and one side's power fatiguing the other, for me, this is the dominant perception that I have associated with Israeli strategic thinkers and politicians in government. The difference has been the degree to which their strategies have attempted to incorporate and be facilitated by consent of a Palestinian leadership. In other words, you have the pure unilateralists, and you have those who have a much more political approach. Okay? It never, ever has excluded the unilateral use of power to distort and create a very unequal situation in which a Palestinian elite or leadership had to either negotiate, try to negotiate, be seen to negotiate, or drop out. So in my view, the real problem is the extent to which the use of force and policies of structural violence that are embodied in the law of occupation violations in the occupied territories, okay, and to a different extent embodied in structural violence within Israel, okay, that is reflected in structural inequalities, institutionalized structural inequalities. The extent to which attention can be addressed to those things, because to me, there is no solution of any that we've entertained that is ever going to materialize as long as the nomos of imposing either through a negotiation-based strategy or a unilateral strategy, okay, the objectives of one over the other, one people over the other. I would argue that I think it's quite urgent to consider the options available to the unilateralists in Israel. In my understanding, okay, the attempt to obtain international acceptance that Israel's responsibilities under the law of occupation and as an occupying power had ended when it withdrew its boots from the ground in Gaza, which was signaled a very dangerous approach to unilaterally resolving the conflict by basically putting the Palestinians in a situation where they would become effectively dismantled socially, economically, and otherwise, going through a very tough period. And this would instigate also flight from the territory. Anybody who could get out, it would be a living hell. I think that the village leagues were an early embodiment of this kind of thinking. Yeah? And it always involved control over Palestinians by Palestinians in a Bantustan-like territorial configuration in which they were, which was their reservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, before you respond, I have one other request from Oren Shlomo, who actually wants to address your talk. And then I believe Efraim Inbar also wants to talk, respond for a minute, but let's have, first we'll have Shlomo, then Sari, and then Efraim. So, Oren, sorry. Oren, please.
Okay, first of all, thank you for fascinating and interesting talks, everybody. I wanted to ask or comment to your talk, Sari, asking if I understand correctly, you were talking about political rights, from the right to get equal services and hold Israel as responsible for direct service provision to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, including all the administrative aspects of that. And I would like to ask or suggest, of course, if I understand correctly, that we had a little bit of experience of that from East Jerusalem. And I think what we learned from that is that direct service provision have a very sophisticated aspects of deepening and entrenching dependency and dismantling resistance and creating subjects that have much more to lose, therefore willing to acquit or to not get, tending not to get very much involved on political basis. I call that a very sophisticated way to governmentalize Palestinians in East Jerusalem and changing the whole urban politics over there on the basis of controlling and managing the infrastructures and services, opening the door for much more sophisticated biopolitics and biopower, which having a very strong effect on the urban politics towards not dismantling, but maybe eroding national sovereignty claiming from the side of the Palestinians. Maybe we can think about these directions. Maybe you can react to this direction of thinking in your response.
Sorry.
Yeah, sure. And thank you for the question. It's a very good one, and I would agree with your assessment that has been the case. I think I'm suggesting two things. One is that we might be in a different moment, and that if demands for services were accompanied by a different kind of struggle, by a struggle that's not about two states ending the occupation, but that acknowledges the fact of one sovereign controlling the entire territory and demanding equality of service provision as part of a greater demand for equality, we might see something different in this moment. And maybe not, but I think that right now we already have that kind of deepening Israeli control. So still people in Gaza are dependent on Israel for electricity. And they're still paying for it. It's just they're not getting enough of it because it's going through this convoluted process in which Israel can deny accountability for electricity. So if we just make that a direct obligation, we also put pressure on the Israeli government. And I appreciated Shaul's estimate of $15 billion a year would be the cost of actually providing those services in the occupied territory. The second point is that the PA agreeing to this role of governance has propagated the fiction of two states, and it's a conflict. And, you know, the PA is sovereign. I remember this line, I can't forget it, from the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs at a March briefing about the coronavirus crisis, when the Israeli government was asking donors, foreign governments, to contribute to a fund for Palestinians. And the foreign donor said, well, what are you doing to provide equipment and supplies? And the answer was, well, it's up to the Palestinian authorities to manage the virus in their territories. So it's their territory when it comes to responsibility, but it's ours when it comes to annexation. I think that the more that we can undermine that fiction, the closer we can get to a process of justice, of equal rights that's not going to come anytime soon. And the comment that I wanted to make, just listening to Samara as well, was that this is a comment for my fellow Jews on the panel and listening. And many of you won't, for many of you, this will be a no-go, so that's okay. But for those of you for whom this might resonate, I would encourage us to question why we see the impossibility of us being safe, of us having good lives, unless our ethnic group is in control, unless we have a tribal basis for a political organization. What assumptions underline that, and to what extent do they conflict with universal values of human rights, of dignity? And the other thing I would encourage my fellow Jews to consider, right, is how much of that fear, the demographic fear, the fear of not having our own state being in control based on ethnicity, how much of that is related to reluctance to give up on privilege? And if you don't know what privileges Israeli Jews have, then think about the question, right? Because I don't think that, you know, having a majority of one ethnic group or another is a threat. I think that, you know, we have so many layers of separation and dehumanization. But if we're talking about a longer term process, a longer term transformation of this land, I think we can get there. And I'm hoping that all of these very rapid changes that we are seeing now could be the beginning of something different.
Sorry, thank you very much. And Efraim, we have time for Efraim would like to say, would like to respond, and then I will wrap up. Efraim.
I want to put the historic and sociological record straight. When Palestinians say that we do not recognize their legitimate rights, they are wrong, simply wrong. The position of the Zionist movement has always been in favor of partition, recognizing that there is another people living in the land of Israel. Second, since 1978, Begin of all people recognized that Camp David, the legitimate, I quote, the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. And there is no reciprocity. The Palestinian national movement till this day does not recognize the Jewish legitimate rights in the land of Israel. This is also how they treat, you know, parts of the land of Israel, occupied. Come on, I'm not an occupier at the Western Wall. And if anybody tells me that he is an occupier because this is what the international law says, the hell with this international law. That is not acceptable. And this goes also to dignity. And here is a different story. I understand the desire of any human being for dignity. But this is not, you know, in certain situations, not the most important value. A more important value is security. You know, I've been a combat soldier for years. I lost many of my friends to Palestinian bullets. During the Intifadas, my kids went by bus and I was afraid for their safety because of Palestinian suicide bombers. So, you know, I admit, dignity, Palestinian dignity is not my most important concern. And if the Palestinians do not understand that, it is their problem. They should understand that our main concern is security. And this is what we got from Egypt, a peace treaty with Egypt, a peace treaty with Jordan, The deal was, you give us security, we give territory. The Rabin deal was territory for security, and he got fed up with Arafat because he didn't deliver security. So unless the Palestinians can put their house in order and deliver security, the conflict will continue. And with all, appreciation for human rights and dignity, all this, our security is more important. We want to live. And now I must leave. I want to finish. It's the eve of 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. The day the temple was destroyed on the Temple Mount. And many Jews go in and fast and mourn this destruction of the temple. And this event should teach us at least one thing. We should be very cautious in the decisions that we make with the foreign policy, because some of them may bring tragic consequences. I was happy to participate. I must go to start, my beginning of the fast. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you. I wish we could continue this discussion. We've heard some very thought-provoking talks which go beyond security. But at this point, I want to thank all of our speakers, panelists, and participants, and reiterate Itamar's recognition and add special thanks to Dr. Rotem Rosenberg-Rubens and Dr. Oren Shlomo for putting together these really fascinating 4 sessions on 25 years since Oslo, contemporary forms of governance, control, and resistance in Israel and Palestine. And I also want to thank Dr. Michal Ben-Gal and almost Dr. Ido Rosenzweig for their invaluable help with organization, technical support, and facilitation. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.